Consider a grunt at the end of his 11th month in the jungle. He has learned, through the specific education that sustained combat provides, exactly how to keep himself alive in an environment designed to kill him. He reads terrain the way civilians read road signs. He processes threat information faster than he can consciously articulate what he is processing. He trusts the three men to his left with a completeness that he has never trusted anyone in his civilian life, and probably never will again. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere, and he has learned to function in that specific ambiguity by developing a nervous system that never fully powers down. In approximately 30 days, he will board an aircraft at Tan Son Nhut Air Base and fly to Travis Air Force Base in California. The flight takes roughly 18 hours. The processing pipeline after landing takes another 24 to 48 hours. Within 72 hours of leaving a combat zone, he will be standing in a supermarket in his hometown trying to decide between two brands of breakfast cereal. The man beside him on that last patrol, the one with 3 months left in his tour, young enough that the jungle hasn't fully finished recalibrating him yet, will spend the next 6 years trying to understand why his marriage failed and why he cannot sleep in a room with a closed door. He will eventually find language for what happened to him. But that language, post-traumatic stress disorder, will not exist as a clinical category until 1980, and the institutional infrastructure for treating it will not reach him for years after that. The grunt behind them, with 9 months in country, who has not yet started counting down his Deros date, the way a prisoner counts days, is heading toward an outcome that neither he nor the Army's exit processing system is equipped to predict or prepare for. Today, we are examining the complete psychological arc of the Vietnam War grunt, not just what combat did to him, but what the specific structure of the war, the rotation system, the exit pipeline, the civilian reception, and the institutional denial that followed, did to his mind across the full span of his experience. Vietnam's psychological damage to the grunt began before he fired his first shot, and it was structural before it was individual. The conventional model of combat psychology assumes a specific organizational unit. Men who trained together, deployed together, fought together, and eventually rotated home together. The shared experience of unit service was understood by military psychiatrists before Vietnam as the primary protective factor against psychiatric breakdown under sustained combat stress. Men who trusted each other, who had built the specific interpersonal knowledge that comes from extended, shared hardship, who knew that the man beside them had been through what they had been through. These men were significantly more resilient, under fire than men who had not built those bonds. Vietnam used the individual replacement system. A grunt completed his training, received his assignment, and flew to Vietnam alone. He arrived at his unit as what soldiers called an FNG, a term whose meaning military historians have sanitized into funny new guy, and which veterans of the WAC period used differently. He was a stranger inserted into a group of men who had established relationships and tactical knowledge and psychological rhythms that he was not part of. The experienced men in his unit understood that he was going to make mistakes that could get people killed, and their response to his presence was calibrated accordingly. Military psychiatrists who studied unit cohesion in Vietnam documented this as the foundational structural flaw in the war's psychological architecture. The individual replacement system continuously degraded the primary protective factor against psychiatric breakdown. Trust between men who had shared sustained hardship. By rotating individuals rather than units, a Grunt who had spent 11 months building the specific interpersonal knowledge that kept him alive was extracted from his unit on his Deros date, while the unit remained deprived of his experience, absorbing a new stranger whose learning curve was paid for in everyone's increased risk. The Deros system also produced a specific psychological phenomenon at the individual level that military medical records documented with increasing frequency through the late 1960s and early 1970s. A soldier approaching the end of his 365-day tour developed what medical personnel and veterans alike referred to as short-timer syndrome. The behavioral profile was consistent across multiple documented cases: increased reluctance to engage in any action that carried risk, withdrawal from the forward edge of whatever patrol or operation the unit was conducting, preoccupation with the countdown to Deros, to the exclusion of present tactical attention, and in a small but documented percentage of cases, the development of specific anxiety symptoms that intensified as the Deros date approached rather than diminishing. The psychology was specific. A man who had spent 11 months surviving something that should have killed him understood, as he entered his final 30 days, that he had beaten the odds once and that the odds reset every time he left the wire. He had a personal finish line. He could see it. Every action he was ordered to take between now and that finish line was an action that could prevent him from reaching it. And his nervous system, finally calibrated by 11 months of survival experience, began orienting its full protective capacity toward the 30 days between him and home. Unit commanders documented the practical consequences of this in their after-action reports. Short-timers became effectively unreliable in situations that required the specific disregard for personal safety that effective infantry combat demanded. They were not cowards. They had spent 11 months demonstrating the opposite. They were men whose survival instinct had been developed to a level of precision that the final 30 days of their tour had given it a specific object to protect. The drug environment that developed within the American forces in Vietnam through the late 1960s was, in part, a direct response to these psychological pressures. Military medical records in the Army's own drug use surveys document the progression. Marijuana use was widespread from the war's early escalation period and spread across a broad demographic range of the force. By 1971, the Army's internal surveys estimated heroin use at between 10 and 15% of military personnel in Vietnam. The specific progression documented in case files, initial use to manage anxiety and sleep disruption, increasing tolerance requiring larger doses, dependency that continued after the original symptom management purpose had been superseded, followed a pattern consistent with self-medication in men whose psychological stress exceeded what unaided human capacity could manage. The Army's institutional response moved through 3 phases: initial denial, followed by punitive enforcement that the scale of the problem made functionally impossible, followed by a pragmatic shift toward medical treatment programs and amnesty provisions, as the realization that the courts-martial pipeline could not process the volume of cases it was receiving. The structural recognition that drug use in the combat zone was a symptom of what the combat environment was producing in men's minds, rather than a disciplinary failure of individual character, came slowly and never fully shaped the institutional response during the active period of the war. Fragging represented the extreme case of institutional psychological breakdown in Vietnam, and it was documented at a scale that had no precedent in American military history. Army records identified approximately 900 verified fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972. 99 officers and non-commissioned officers were killed. The true number was almost certainly higher because the forensic distinction between a fragging and a combat death was not always determinable, and because many fragging threats were never carried out, but were effective as behavioral modification tools without being recorded as incidents. The profile that military investigators reconstructed from documented cases was consistent. A grunt who had lost faith in the value of the objectives he was being ordered to pursue, who had watched men die for ground that was abandoned the following week, who had developed a specific distrust of an officer whose command decisions were, in the grunt's assessment, trading his survival for outcomes that served the officer's career rather than the mission's purpose. A grunt who had access to fragmentation grenades and to an officer who slept in a known location. This was not random violence. It was the specific intersection of psychological degradation, institutional loss of confidence, and the material means to act on both. The Army's response, intensified investigation, increased security protocols around officer quarters, addressed the symptom rather than the structural conditions that produced it. The fragging rate remained consistent through the period of the war's peak psychological deterioration. The exit pipeline that processed the grunt from Vietnam back to the civilian world was structurally designed, with whatever degree of intentionality, to maximize the psychological damage of the transition. The 72-hour timeline from combat zone to hometown, in a firefight on Tuesday, in a bedroom on Friday, was not merely psychologically jarring. It was physiologically incoherent. The nervous system that had been conditioned through 365 days of sustained threat response, calibrated to process every environmental signal for potential danger, presented with the specific behavioral profile that calibration produced in civilian environments: hypervigilance, inability to tolerate enclosed spaces, exaggerated startle response, difficulty tolerating the specific randomness of civilian social environments, had received no decompression, no transition, no period of graduated normalization. Project Transition was the Pentagon's institutional response to the problem of returning grunts to civilian employment. The program offered 6 months of vocational training before discharge, data processing certificates, small engine repair, credentials theoretically useful in the civilian labor market. The execution failed for a structural reason that the ICE program's design phase had not adequately anticipated. Combat commanders refused to pull men off active duty for training classes. Participation rates were far below targets, and even among men who completed coursework, civilian employers consistently declined to treat military vocational certificates as meaningful credentials. The document that was supposed to smooth the transition was worth approximately nothing in the civilian job market. The civilian job market's reception of Vietnam veterans compounded the exit pipeline's failures. American media coverage through the early and middle 1970s had produced a cultural image of the Vietnam veteran as psychologically unstable, potentially violent, a liability in any workplace requiring reliable professional behavior. This image was deployed explicitly by employers who preferred not to hire men who might bring the war's consequences into their operations. The veteran who had kept himself alive and his unit functional through a year of sustained combat, who had demonstrated exactly the qualities, discipline, performance under pressure, the ability to execute in conditions of uncertainty that civilian employers described themselves as valuing, was processed through the civilian hiring market as a risk rather than an asset. The career paths that absorbed significant numbers of Vietnam veterans reflected this reception and the specific psychological profiles the war had produced. Law enforcement recruited from the Vietnam veteran pool because the skill set translated directly to performance under threat, familiarity with weapons, command of fear response in dangerous environments, legible hierarchy, and rank structure. For men whose psychological wounds manifested as hypervigilance and inability to feel safe unarmed, police work legitimized what civilian environments pathologized. What was a symptom in a supermarket checkout line was a professional asset in a patrol car. Long-haul trucking absorbed veterans for whom the isolation was the point. The sealed cab alone on a highway for 12 hours at a stretch replicated in its psychological structure something about the concentrated solitary alertness of the patrol environment without the mortal stakes. It required skills that didn't depend on translating military experience into civilian credential language. It provided independence from organizational structures that the war had taught these men to distrust. The fact that it was grinding, poorly compensated work that destroyed the body over time was a secondary consideration to the specific psychological fit it provided. The men who re-enlisted, who signed extension papers, or returned for additional tours were not, as they were sometimes characterized, simply addicted to combat in the Hollywood sense of the term. The psychological reality that veterans described was more specific and in some ways more tragic than addiction. The jungle had recalibrated what felt real. Everything else felt thin. The relationships the war had produced, built under conditions of absolute mutual dependence in an environment where the cost of trusting the wrong person was death, were relationships of a density and authenticity that civilian life did not provide, and that the war had made the standard against which everything else was measured. Going back was not choosing combat. It was choosing the only environment in which these men felt entirely real, the long-term aftermath. The decades of fighting the Veterans Administration for recognition of Agent Orange exposure, of fighting for the clinical acknowledgement of post-traumatic stress disorder before it had a name, of fighting for benefits and services from an institution that had used these men and then largely preferred not to deal with the consequences of having used them, was the final phase of the Grunt's psychological experience of the Vietnam War. The men who survived the jungle and navigated the exit pipeline and rebuilt civilian lives without institutional support did so primarily on personal resilience that the system had not done much to preserve. If you are a Vietnam veteran who experienced any phase of the psychological arc described in this video, the rotation system, the transition, the civilian reception, the decades of institutional denial, your account is part of the historical record this channel exists to document. The comments are open and the sources are in the description. Subscribe for more Vietnam content examining the complete human reality of the war. Thank you for watching.